Thank you very much. Good morning. I hope that you can all hear me well. I am joining you virtually from Potsdam, and I am delighted to join this conference that is with so many other pioneers, such as State Secretary Fuchtel and other players. I would like to embed this whole issue in the context of climate change. Climate change and the forgotten great transformation. We need several transformations, of course, in the energy sector, in the generation of electricity, but the built environment is the decisive factor here, actually. So we need a combined transformation, so to speak, of the forestry and the construction industry. And that is what I wanted to talk about. I will try to move the presentation and skip to the next slide. Yes, it worked. It has already been mentioned. The climate crisis is of great significance, and it poses a threat to the entire society and to the next generation. Here you can see the final scene of the climate summit in 2015. And the result of this conference was to limit the temperature rise to below 1.5 degrees Celsius. This is a global agreement, and it is also constitutional law. Why was this adopted? Well, based on scientific results, and I would like to explain this to you in this context. So let's continue with my presentation. Well, first of all, how far away are we from this decisive figure? On the left-hand side here, you can see an illustration that shows that in 2020 compared to the year 2016, the climate anomaly is quite striking here. So we have almost reached this barrier, this decisive barrier. So it is high time to change our behavior. And this is also the justification for this 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius. Here you can see an illustration that I did for a meeting. It shows the tipping elements in our world. Several components of the Earth system will be tipped. For example, the Great Barrier Reef, the Amazon rainforest, the ice sheets will start to melt, and our world would change fundamentally. So our environment that led to the emergence of Homo sapiens and the foundation and of human civilization, all of this would disappear. And this is what we are risking at the moment. And here you can see a summary that I published in a publication with some colleagues some time ago. So we can see here when we would reach the tipping points. You can see the Paris range here, that is the gray bar in the middle between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius. And even if we were able to stop global warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius, we would lose great parts of the coral reefs, and our ice shields would melt. But if we were to exceed this 1.5 degrees Celsius, we would see further melting, for example, of the Arctic winter sea ice, and this would increase to this would lead to an increase of our oceans and our sea level, and we don't want to imagine that. And I showed you these tipping elements because the Federal Constitutional Court published a justification, and you can see here This phenomenon of the tipping elements and the publications is taken into account explicitly for this decision that was taken by the Federal Constitutional Court. And this is an encouraging sign that scientific proof, and we saw this also in the coronavirus pandemic, provides guidance for political action at the highest level. It has also been mentioned by State Secretary Fuchtel and by Minister Heinen-Esser why and how we can stop this global warming developments. And this has to do with the fact that on the one hand, of course, we need to decarbonize with the means that are available to us. And here you can see also the results from a publication from a few years ago. There's an exponential decline of the emissions until 2050. But what will also be decisive, if we continue with the next slide, I don't know how to skip to the next slide here. Nothing's happening at the moment. Okay, so now it's working. But let me go back just one more slide. Small technical issues. So this green circle that you can see here is very important in this context. This is a result published by the IPCC. So decarbonization will not suffice. This is the result. We need to massively strengthen our natural carbon sinks. So what does carbon sinks mean? It could be anything, and I will show you in a second. Namely, the IPCC explicitly mentions that we need negative emissions. So not only do we need to reduce the negative emissions to zero, the positive emissions to zero, we also need negative emissions. And this leads me to my next chart, to my next slide. Here on the right-hand side, on the bottom, we see the great contribution that negative emissions can make. But how can we achieve this situation? There are buzzwords such as carbon capture storage. Of course, forestry and the wood industry play an important role here. So technical processes, cleansing the bioatmosphere, all of this is important, but the most important point is the sustainable management of renewable resources, for example, construction with wood. And this is not being taken into account here. And this brings me to my next slide. So let's now address the elephant in the climate room, so to speak, because in our societies and all around the globe, we are talking about emissions in air traffic, but we are not addressing the about 40% of global greenhouse gas emissions that are a result of the construction of buildings, so our built environment. So we have not yet addressed this problem in detail. And the way we are constructing buildings, the materials we are using, how we are using these buildings, and the recycling of these buildings that have been torn down, all of this is the elephant in the climate room. And if we do not address this elephant in the room, then we will not be able to succeed in our goal to achieve limiting the temperature rise. And you can see a double slogan here, a double motto: reforesting the planet and retimbering the city. This is part of a presentation that I held a couple of weeks ago. So we need to construct our built environment with natural resources, but of course this needs the supply side as well. So we need to ensure that we have sustainable renewable resources and produce them sustainably as well. Next slide, please. And last year we published a pioneering work in Nature Stability. It's called Buildings as a Global Carbon Sink. So using organic architecture, so to speak, and use these buildings as a very potent carbon sink, and thereby redeeming ourselves and changing what we have done to our natural environment in the past years. Global population is increasing. More than 2 billion people will populate the planet in the future, or 2 additional billion people will populate the planet in the future. And if we were to use 10% of wood in our construction, then we would be able to decrease our emissions significantly. However, if we were to use 90% of wood in our construction, hemp, bamboo, wood, etc., then we would not only prevent the emission of these greenhouse gas emissions, but we would also sequester carbon from, fix carbon from the atmosphere. So only by using different building materials we would make such a huge difference. And this is, of course, a great possibility. It is the win-win strategy that we have been looking for such a long time. And no one has been looking for this strategy in the past, with a few exceptions, maybe. So this looks like quite a complex model, but simplified, it means that the additional CO2 emissions that are emitted to the atmosphere, that they would be taken up by these carbon pumps, also by sustainable forest management, also by using wood construction materials, also by using wood in buildings that can stand for very long times, and also recycling these materials and afforestation. Afforestation of degraded areas in 100 or 200 years would make a significant contribution to the cleansing of our atmosphere, and in the short term it would lead to the prevention of further emissions from the construction energy. So there is a preventive function, but also the function of fixing carbon emissions. There's also a debate on the forestry sector. There are different research projects that we have launched, but in short, in the Northern Hemisphere, we won't have that many problems with short-term emissions, because our forest areas, our woodlands, will increase in the future. For example, in China, the great problem is the global south, where forest areas are degraded massively. And from a climate and species conservation standpoint, this is a disaster. There need to be national discussions about this topic. Next slide. Just one example that shows that there is hope. On the left-hand side, you can see a plateau in China in 2007, and on the right-hand side, you see a green landscape, and this is 2019. And this is the Sinai Peninsula. This is an ambitious project. Of course, it is a vision. It is a project that strives to regreen this area. So on the right-hand side, you see the projections for the future. On the left-hand side, we see patterns of old river systems. So you can see that it would be possible to renaturate these areas and regreen them, and thus also produce renewable resources. And this would, of course, benefit the Egyptian economy. So what kind of wood do we have in Germany? This is what you can see here. Next slide shows what's important, and this is how we use our woods. We have wood-based materials, we have pulp and also mechanical wood pulp, and bioenergy. And here you can see a development that concerns me personally. You can see that in 1990 the material use dominated. The energetic use has caught up in the meantime and is currently even exceeding the material use of wood. So if wood is burned, CO2 goes back into the atmosphere, but if you fix these carbon emissions in buildings, then you have a circular economy. So material use needs to dominate, for example, by the use of wood in the construction sector. So to burn wood is a mistake. Here you can see the cascade use. So if we burn wood, then we have a very long cascading use, or we should have a long cascading use over several decades. This is the Ultima ratio. And let's continue with the next slide. This brings me to the initiative that has already been mentioned, that was launched 2 years ago, a non-profit GmbH, Bauhaus for the Earth. And you can see a press article here that was published recently by me in the newspaper Frankfurter Allgemeine. So we want to bring back the Bauhaus movement. This is just a picture to show the Bauhaus movement from the past, and this is these are the participants of our vision Bauhaus for the Earth. For example, Monika Grütters, State Minister for Culture, then Manja Schüle as Minister for Research and Development. And we also mentioned lightweight construction, so they are very famous architects that are part of our groups, intellectuals, Walter Gropius, for example, and also artists such as Volker Schönhoff, etc. So this is the new circle of people. And this brings me to my last slide. This movement was also heard at European level, due to the context that we have at European level, of course, and I was delighted when Ursula von der Leyen, in her State of the Union address, presented an initiative that surprised many, which is a new European Bauhaus strategy. So a green Bauhaus movement at European level as well, that will serve as a role model for the entire globe, but that will also be a movement that brings forth the knowledge and experience from all over the world and tries to bring it together and link it to our European traditions. I believe that it is an initiative that will change the world, and I am very thankful to Ursula von der Leyen for launching this initiative. So finally, after 100 years, we have started a debate again on how the construction sector, with support from the forestry industry, can address the issue of wood, thus securing our civilization. Thank you very much for your attention.